Welcome everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Olick. I'm the director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies and also faculty member in the Sociology department. It's a pleasure to welcome you all and to welcome our guest, Professor Jeffrey Olick, to this end of the semester lecture of the Center, which we have co-organized together with the Center for German and European Studies. And I also want to acknowledge the support of the Ohanessian Fund for Peace and Justice of the Minneapolis Foundation. Today is May 8th, the day of Nazi Germany's unconditional surrender and the end of World War II in Europe. In the US, in France, in Britain, in all of liberated Europe, millions took the streets to celebrate. In Germany, it was Stunde Null, 0 hour. An opportunity for a new beginning in the midst of massive destruction perpetrated by Nazi Germany, destruction self-inflicted by the Nazi state. Germany had to come to terms with this criminal past, to confront its crimes, and this process, which began May 8, 1945, and it's still ongoing, is the subject of this book by Jeffrey Olick, our guest today, The Sins of the Fathers, and also the topic of the lecture. Jeffrey Olick is professor of sociology at the University of Virginia, and he is also one of the most prominent researchers in the field of memory studies. He is the author of numerous books and articles that have been seminal and very inspiring to many of us that work in the field of collective memory, difficult past, transitional justice, and also helpful in our teaching. So we're thrilled to have Professor Olick here for this end of the year lecture. We thank you for being here with us. Thank you all for coming. Please join me in welcoming Professor Olick.
So is this working?
Yes.
Close enough?
Yeah.
Good. I guess behold the power of a free lunch. Thank you all for coming. I'm thrilled to be here, and thanks to Alejandro for everything he's done and his extraordinary hospitality. I admit to a little bit of a bait and switch, a very small bait and switch, namely that months and months in advance, hosts ask you for a title and what you want to talk about, and if the topic is broad enough, you say something and then you're constrained by that title as you prepare. So the talk was advertised under the title of my most recent book. I'm going to be a little bit more specific, and so the title you see before you, I'm sorry, the type is so small, you never know how big the screen is a piece of this. I can't cover a 500-page book in a 40-minute lecture. So the title of today's lecture is Why the Angel of Revenge is a Jew. Okay, and I'll explain what that means as I go along. In the 1990s, the German novelist, exile novelist, I guess, living in Great Britain, W.G. Sebald, many of you probably have read, marvelous novelist, wrote a controversial essay called The Air, War, and Literature. And in this essay, Sebald accused German writers, specifically German novelists and poets, of not having represented the traumatic experience of having suffered through mass bombings of the German population during World War II. Already the taboo here has been broken. We're not supposed to talk about the traumas of the perpetrators. And Sebald, however, sees the lack of an articulation of that experience in German culture in the post-war period as a deficit. He writes, "The sense of unparalleled national humiliation arising from the destruction of the German cities and the horrors of the bombing nights never really found verbal expression. Those directly affected by the experience neither shared it with each other nor passed it on to the next generation." So Sebald is articulating what he sees as a taboo. The new federal German society relegated the experience of its own prehistory to the back of its mind and developed an almost perfectly functioning mechanism of repression, one which allowed it to recognize the fact of its own rise from total degradation while disengaging from its stock of emotions. There's sort of two ways that you can go with this. You can say that the repressed inevitably will return, and so the lack of, in the words of Theodor Adorno, a working through, or Aufarbeitung der Vergangenheit, a working through of the past, will lay minefields for the future. But I don't think this was necessarily Sebald's thesis. It was that a trauma had not been acknowledged, and therefore there were problematic moral problems that resulted. I'll begin my story, however, in a very different place. This is Henry Morgenthau Jr. standing next to Franklin Roosevelt. Henry Morgenthau was Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary. They'd gotten to know each other in New York politics. Morgenthau himself, the junior, is important here because his father, Henry Morgenthau Sr., was the American ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, to Turkey, who witnessed firsthand the Armenian genocide. Morgenthau was a very young man in his late teens and early 20s, living with his father, and so he experienced and observed from Istanbul what had happened, and this shaped him in profound ways. Morgenthau, however, is most known as Treasury Secretary during the New Deal for being one of the leaders of trust-busting efforts of the Roosevelt administration. However, most significantly for my talk today, Morgenthau is also known as having been the highest-ranked Jew in the history of American politics. No Jew had ever served as a cabinet secretary, and this point about Morgenthau is of the essence. Let me skip around just a bit. Namely, in 1943 and 1944, there was a powerful debate among the planners in the American government about what was to be done with Germany after it was defeated. First of all, the first question was, what is the Allied goal in the war? The goal, they decided at the Casablanca Conference of 1943, was nothing short of unconditional surrender of Nazi Germany. Now, we speak of this term unconditional surrender as if it's a non-problematic concept, but it's really unclear what unconditional surrender would mean. There's a long history of this term that I won't go into. Nevertheless, there was a debate that went through most of 1944 about what exactly the occupation would look like. Morgenthau was concerned that nobody was actually undertaking any planning for this, that there was no coherent program for what to do. And so Morgenthau undertook his own effort to plan, and in fact appointed his deputy, Harry Dexter White, who later turns out was a Russian spy, just to complicate the matter, to come up with a plan which Morgenthau then tried to compel the Americans and the British to impose. This became known as the Morgenthau Plan, which Morgenthau brought to the Quebec Conference in 1944, which presented the plan, which was largely for a demilitarization and deindustrialization of Germany. Morgenthau's theory, based on his experience as a trust buster, was that the capacity of Germany to wage 2 aggressive wars in 1 century resided in the industrial might, namely the mines and the factories of the Ruhr area, but the military-industrial complex, well, later in United States history called the military-industrial complex in Germany. And so Morgenthau's plan was to close the mines, was to dismantle industry, and transform the German economy into such a form that it could no longer produce the armaments it would need to lead wars of aggression. When he presented this to Roosevelt and Churchill in Quebec, Churchill quipped that this was an effort to pastoralize Germany, to throw it back to the 19th century, to turn it into a vast version of rural Denmark or something like that. Now, none of this really was exactly what Morgenthau had intended, and yet when word of the Morgenthau Plan leaked out, it garnered quite a bit of notoriety. One particular place in which Morgenthau was most notorious was in Nazi German propaganda. And it was indeed Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, who in a newspaper article reacting to the rumors of the Morgenthau Plan, declared that Henry Morgenthau Jr. was the angel of revenge. And the reason that Morgenthau was the angel of revenge was inevitable and ineluctable, namely that he was a Jew. And what could a Jew want more than to destroy Germany entirely? Just to slip ahead, there was a book published about the time by a dry goods salesman living in New Jersey named Theodor Kaufmann, who wrote a book, Germany Must Perish, the book that Hitler fears. And this was a piece of trash, amateurish, kind of rabble-rousing by somebody who at that time couldn't be elected president of the United States, but things have changed. He wrote this thing, and one of the things that this guy Kaufmann wrote is he said that in fact what we should do is we should sterilize all the German men so that they can't reproduce and Germany dies out from the face of the earth. One of the features of Goebbels' reaction to the Morgenthau Plan was actually the accusation that Kaufmann was simply a pen name for Roosevelt himself. And that Roosevelt had written this book because Roosevelt, who was suspiciously friendly with the Jews, maybe even a crypto-Jew himself, was buddies with his friend Morgenthau, and therefore this was a representative of the sentiments that the vengeful Americans, who were in fact run by a Jewish conspiracy, would take. Now, it was not, however, only Goebbels who had a, let's say, healthier. What happened to my text here? Something has happened to the font. So I don't know what happened. It wasn't the last time. Anyway, Henry Stimson was the Secretary of War in Roosevelt's cabinet and was fairly different from Morgenthau, was from the opposite end of the political spectrum. But Stimson was most concerned with the possibility of an ascendant Soviet Union after the war. And so what Stimson wanted very much to do was to defeat the Nazis and use Germany as a bulwark against Soviet aggression. And so what Stimson wanted was a soft peace in contrast to Morgenthau's hard peace. Now, the reputation of Morgenthau's desires for Germany as a hard peace were exaggerated. One of the words that was used was called, accused of being a Carthaginian solution for Germany to evoke slaughter and punishment. So here we have just a quote from Goebbels: "Hate and revenge of a truly Old Testament character are dear in the plans dreamed up by the American Jew Morgenthau. Industrialized Germany should literally be turned into a huge potato field." So that's Goebbels. Here is Stimson, however. Stimson, in his memoirs published after the war, had written in his diaries that Morgenthau was so biased by his Semitic grievance that he really is a very dangerous advisor to the president. Morgenthau, is not unnaturally very bitter, and became very apparent that he would plunge out for a treatment of Germany which I feel sure would be unwise. The objective of punishment is prevention, but not vengeance. This is a reason why a Jew is disqualified, according to Stimson. And in one of his great sentences that I think is very important in American history is Stimson's assertion that the Morgenthau Plan is Semitism gone wild for vengeance. Now here's a particularly interesting equation which we're going to see again and again in Stimson's writing. It would be just such a crime as the Germans themselves hope to perpetrate upon their victims. It would be a crime against civilization itself. So let's just think about exactly what Stimson is saying here. That an effort to deindustrialize Germany, to lame its capacity for waging war, was equivalent, basically the same thing, that Germany was doing to the Jews. Now, I don't know about you, but I don't think closing a mine is quite the same thing as opening a death camp, but apparently the subtlety was lost on Stimson. Now, I'm giving a fairly historical and empirical talk, but what I want to say is actually something philosophical. I have what I think of as an ontological problem. What does that mean? Fancy $5 professor word. Ontology is the theory of being. What is the thing, the nature of the thing that I'm talking about. What I'm going to do in the next few minutes is I'm going to identify a thing. The question for me is, what kind of a thing is it? I haven't figured this out yet, so I actually would like to know what you think this thing is. The thing may be described as culture. It may be described as collective psychology. It may be defined as a vocabulary. But what is particularly clear to me, and which was a revelation when I was doing this work empirically, is to discover it in the first place. What I discovered in this work was that Stimson's equation of the proposed American treatment, as however misrepresented it was, of the Germans after World War II was in fact echoed, was the view that the Germans themselves had of the occupation plan and of the occupation itself. Namely, that everything done to Germany after the war was equivalent, similar to, or in some cases exactly the same, and in one or two cases even worse than what the Germans did to the Jews. So the question is, what is such a thing that leads people across the political and cultural spectrum? What I'm going to show you is a number of examples of politicians, philosophers, theologians, psychologists, journalists, public cultural figures repeating this. I guess one word for this thing is a trope. Namely, that the treatment of Germans after the war was equivalent to the treatment of Jews by the Nazis during the war, and that as a result, the Germans are best understood as the new Jews. Again, what kind of a thing is that? Let's start over here. A little clear. I really don't know what happened to the font. Here is a picture from 1952 of the first president of the Federal Republic of Germany, Theodor Heuss, who, in the context of negotiating a reparations agreement with the newly merged state of Israel, attended a ceremony at the extermination camp in Bergen-Belsen, November 30th, 1952, and Heuss gives a speech there. One of the things that was sort of a remarkable experience doing this research is every time you sat down, okay, so the first president of West Germany is going to give the first speech of a German political leader after the war in a concentration camp. Okay, what's he going to say? I assure you, they never said what you would have guessed they were going to say. Not once in 50 years of speeches did I ever guess right. It made the research interesting. So this is what Theodor Heuss says in Bergen-Belsen, standing next to Nahum Goldman, the Jewish leader. It seems to me that the tariff of virtue with which the nations equip themselves is a trite and pernicious thing. It endangers the clear and decent sense of patriotism which will support everyone who consciously lives in history, and which may lend pride and assurance to anyone who perceived the great events, but must not be allowed to seduce us into apathy of Pharisaic self-assurance. Now, let me just put a pin, which I tried to do with italics, which disappeared in computer land, in this notion of the Pharisees. Who are the Pharisees? Matthew 23. How terrible for you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, hypocrites. From Luke 18. People who were sure of their own goodness and despised everybody else. What, however, is the most salient feature of a Pharisee? Anybody?
Priesthood. All the rabbis.
Pharisees are Jews. So, the occupation authorities, who are self-righteous and superior and condescending to the Germans they have defeated, are behaving like the Pharisees, which are basically hypocritical Jews. I lost count. At a certain point I was keeping count, and I just gave up keeping count. How many? I never heard the word, that's my own poor religious education. I never heard the word Pharisee before I started doing this research, and yet there it was in every single speech. Again and again and again and again. You could have said hypocritical, self-righteous, condescending, but no, they chose Pharisees or Pharisaical. Now, granted, the word Pharisee and the adjective Pharisaisch in German has somewhat different valence. It's more deeply embedded in the culture. Even so, even if it's a more common word than you would have in American English at the time, it was still a remarkable occurrence. Just another example of Morgenthau's reputation, not merely among the Germans, but also in America. Here is the January 23rd, 1943 cover of Time magazine depicting Morgenthau in what can only be described as an anti-Semitic stereotype. I mean, the number of anti-Semitic, it's sort of like a challenge accepted. How many anti-Semitic stereotypes can you cram into one image, right? So you've got the hook-nosed, beady-eyed, bald guy, and of course, because he's a Jew, all right, he's the Treasury Secretary, but he's drowning in a sea of money. It's a powerful image. I wonder if anybody has seen it recently. Couldn't help but notice that it's scary.
Isn't it?
So one of the questions we have, actually let me skip ahead and come back to this. Here are a few examples. The question is, were the Germans actually being condescended to in the way that the claim of Pharisaism implied? Here's just a few examples. During so-called denazification processes, the first years after the war, 45 to 47, and then a curtailed phase after 47, there was a process known as denazification. Every German adult, they kept changing the age ranges, cutting off the old people, cutting off the young people, but many, many German adults were required to fill out a questionnaire called a Fragebogen. It was an example of the actual questionnaire, which asked about their activities during the war and their Nazi affiliation. There were 131 questions on this questionnaire. Date of birth, what kind of military, when were you in the military, what did you do, were you a member of the party, all of these questions. This particular form was then the subject of a satire by an ultra-conservative German writer from the Weimar period, Ernst von Salomon, who had the following characterization of the Fragebogen, or the survey. When the Americans decided to pass the contents of the pot, in which everything had been stewed up together through the sieve, they found in their sieves many categories of man as there had been in that other pot, the Jewish one. It was the second greatest crime of the terrible simplificateur that they had not attempted to pass the contents of the Jewish pot through their sieve, the greatest being that they had simply destroyed the whole brew. And that's a kind of mouthful, and the translation's not great. What's he talking about? Well, the Nazis lumped all the Jews together and didn't differentiate the good Jews from the bad Jews, and in fact, and it was a mistake to try to differentiate at all. Salomon here is arguing that the Fragebogen, the effort of denazification, is employing the same thing, that everybody should be examined, that we can make fine distinctions between people based on their activities in certain circumstances, is the same thing. Here's another example from the religious end of things. Bishop Theophile Wurm, who in his analysis both of the occupation but of the Fragebogen, and in particular he was concerned about the British policy of billeting British soldiers in German households, arguing one of his statements about this is there's something Bolshevistic about it. Bolshevistic, of course, in German discourse at the time, is a dog whistle of sorts. And this, remember, is a deeply religious figure. It is dear to us that our cities would not be dying. It is clear to us, I honestly don't know what happened to this one, but it's not that way, it's not over here. It is clear to us that our cities would not be dying of hunger on the roads. Our soldiers would not be withering away in detention camps if millions had not been forced previously to endure a similar fate. So the similar fate, right, the concentration camps where the Jews were in prison, is now happening to the Germans. Nevertheless, it is from a sense of deep concern that we call your attention to one fact. Good has not simply triumphed over evil with the Allied victory. What has been done since then in many occupation zones in the sphere of denazification was likewise not always designed to awake the impression of a high degree of justice and humanity. To squeeze the German people together, we're talking about population transfers after the Potsdam Accords, to squeeze the German people together in an ever more crowded space and to reduce its possibilities for life as much as possible cannot, in fundamental terms, be evaluated any differently than the extermination plans of Hitler against the Jewish race. I'm just going to read that one again because it's a personal favorite. To squeeze the German people together in an ever more crowded space and to reduce its possibilities for life as much as possible cannot, in fundamental terms, be evaluated any differently than the extermination plans of Hitler against the Jewish race. Let that sink in for a minute. Billeting policies, a denazification procedure, population transfers is the same thing as the mass extermination of 6 million people. It cannot be evaluated any differently? I think so. Another religious philosophical figure, again with the Jewish tropes, is Eugen Kogan, one of the founding fathers of the Christian Democratic Union after the war. The form in which one has tried for more than 2 years, this is from 1947, more than 2 years to free the German people from National Socialism and militarism has contributed much to the thoroughly chaotic condition in which we find ourselves. Except that it's a lot. It didn't go well with denazification. The result is foremost. Everyone who is informed knows it. Less denazification than renazification. So in other words, Allied effort to denazify Germany is actually causing a Nazi backlash. There's no evidence that it was the case. The nasty saying is going around, the more we bask in the democratic sun, the browner we get. Brown being the color of the Nazis. German deficiencies and Allied mistakes have complemented each other with disastrous certainty, as if they were in cahoots, and have to this point stymied all efforts of the judicious. One has regarded the entire German people with a Nazi lens. As a result, one has accused it as a collectivity. Many today in Germany say, where do the Allies get the right to sit in moral judgment of us? Is their history free from violence and atrocities? To this moral question, the Bible has already answered, insofar as the prophet named the dictator Nebuchadnezzar the servant of God, who was sent by him to lead the people of Israel out of terror, out of error. For the honest man accused, the others are servants of God to him, whether just or unjust. He allows them the victor's triumph, even when they have gone the same or similar way that has made him guilty, and does not consider himself the toll collector. Lord, I thank you, I'm not like that Pharisee over there. So again, the idea of the dictator Nebuchadnezzar, the servant of God who was sent to lead the people of Israel out of error. Right? The equation of the Germans with the Jews. Another example, the theologian Karl Barth, who you see here pictured decades later with Martin Luther King. It will not be easy to make clear to them, meaning the Germans, that we mean them well. Barth himself was Swiss. That we are turning to them without conditions, and that we want to meet them not as the Pharisee did the publican, and that nevertheless, in this respect, we cannot yield them an inch. All is lost if we meet them in a Pharisaic fashion. Don't be a Jewish angel of revenge. The Germans are there as the Jews are there, with whose nature and destiny they have so much in common. There's another theologian, Helmut. Barth is right when he speaks of a necessity for a confession of guilt. Give us the inner freedom to make it. Give it to us in an attitude of readiness to confess that we have need 7 times sevenfold of forgiveness. Frenchmen, Americans, Englishmen, Germans, Japanese, and Jews. Okay. Good time to be lecturing the Jews about their need to confess their sins. What sins exactly are we talking about isn't entirely clear. Similar theme was also present in the lectures given during winter 45-46 by the philosopher Karl Jaspers. Jaspers gave a series of lectures in Heidelberg. A rare photograph of it here, took a long time to find. You can see, if the picture were better, you can see that everybody is wearing coats because there was no heat in the lecture hall. These lectures were then reworked into a book called Die Schuldfrage, or the question, translated as the question of German guilt. And Jaspers came to his German compatriots with a rather burdensome argument. Jaspers was a good guy, as far as I'm concerned. Married to a Jew, went into retreat during the Nazi period, stopped writing, stopped lecturing, was in grave danger. And in particular in 1945-46, Jaspers wanted to be clear that just because, sorry, they're out of order, just because there had been the Nuremberg Tribunals, which I'll come back to in a moment, and the defendants, most of the 21 of the 24 defendants at Nuremberg had been convicted, the German people were not done with working through the Nazi past. Right? So in fact, what Jaspers did is he articulated a set of different kinds of what he called guilt and responsibility. There's an ambiguity in the subtitle of the book. The book is called Die Schuldfrage, the question of guilt, and the subtitle is on the politischen Haftung Deutschlands. Haftung is responsibility or legal liability. And Jaspers says that just because we've tried the criminal leaders of the regime, we're not by any means done. He articulates a distinction among four distinct kinds of guilt. The first he calls criminal guilt, which is the kind that can be tried in a court of law. Did you give the order for the people to be killed? Did you pull the trigger? Did you break the law as it stood at the time? Kind of thing that a court can determine you're innocent or guilty. There were complexities at Nuremberg. At that time I'll return to that. Jaspers said there are three additional kinds of guilt. The second kind of guilt is what he calls political guilt. And the German people, in Jaspers' version, bear a political guilt. Many of them voted for Hitler. The technical defense is the majority never voted for Hitler, but by the mid-1930s, Hitler did have, according to the best public opinion data available, which is problematic, did have majority support of the German population. Was there enthusiasm for Hitler, if not for Hitler himself, at least for his policies? Did you live in a polity that was governed in this way, and therefore do you bear some political guilt and responsibility? The third kind of guilt that Jaspers talks about is moral guilt. Moral guilt is the guilt that you accrue as to whether you did everything you could, whether you spoke up, whether you were complicit in some moral way. Did you maybe have your business do a little bit better because the Jewish shop next door disappeared? Did you maybe get a bigger apartment or a quicker promotion? Because the Jew ahead of you, who knows where they went? Who knows? This produces a different kind of guilt. Moral guilt. You may not have killed anybody. You may not even have committed a crime. It does not mean you are guilt-free. The final kind of guilt that Jaspers talks about, he calls metaphysical guilt, which in many ways is akin to the Christian notion of original sin. Namely, that we now are all guilty because we live in a world that knows that such things are possible. We are, in some sense, fallen and damaged, and we must acknowledge and work through this metaphysical guilt. In particular, Jaspers is arguing against his former friend, the philosopher Martin Heidegger, who was profoundly complicit with the Nazis, basically saying that, and Jaspers at the time was in charge of writing the Gutachten, the evaluation for Heidegger's denazification. And in fact, Jaspers wrote that he did not feel that Heidegger could be returned to the right to teach at universities, that he still was too dangerous because he had not repented, he had not confessed, he had not acknowledged his role in the regime. Even Jaspers, however, a good guy, turns in the direction of the thing, whatever the thing might be. To condemn summarily people as a whole, or every member of this people, seems to me to violate the claim of being human. No verdict on an individual person, even less so on all members of the people, is true that claims this is the way they are. This logic is a means of mutual hatred of peoples and groups. It was applied in the most evil way by the National Socialists and was drummed into people's heads by their propaganda. Now, I actually agree with the first sentence. No verdict on an individual person, even less so on all members of people, is true that claims this is the way they are. I agree with that. I think that's a good principle. And yet, collectivist thinking, was what the Nazis did to the Jews, and collectivist thinking was what was actually being done to the Germans. Okay. Now, the political question is whether it's politically sensible, purposeful, safe, and just to turn a whole nation into a pariah nation, to degrade it beneath all others, to dishonor further once it had dishonored itself. The pariah nation, German pariah folk. Jaspers is a protege of the great sociologist Max Weber. When Max Weber wrote his Sociology of Judaism, Sociology of the Jews, he was the one who characterized the Jews as the pariah folk. And so Jaspers very clearly was adopting Weber's terms for the Jews, but not for the Jews anymore, but for the Germans. Does it make sense to turn the Germans into the pariah folk, in other words, into the new Jews? A world opinion which condemns the people collectively as of a kind with the fact that for thousands of years men have said, thought and said, the Jews are guilty of the crucifixion. Who are the Jews? A certain group of religious and political zealots whose relative power among the Jews of that time with the Roman occupation authorities led to the execution of Jesus. So again, don't treat Germany like the Jews were treated. Karl Zuckmeyer didn't have a picture. Doesn't really matter who he was. We Germans share with the Jews a certain unpopularity in the world that always distorts other people's views of us. Okay? Thomas Mann, great novelist. These lines from Dr. Faustus, his literary effort to come to terms with the Nazi regime. Our thick-walled torture chamber into which Germany was transformed by a vile regime of conspirators sworn to nihilism from the very start has been burst open, and our ignominy lies naked before the eyes of the world. Okay, that's the reason he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. Nice sentence. What will it be like to belong to a nation whose history bore this gruesome fiasco within it? A nation that has driven itself mad, gone psychologically bankrupt, that admittedly despairs of governing itself and thinks it's best that it become a colony of foreign powers. A nation that will have to live in isolated confinement. Like whom? One guess, like the Jews of the ghetto. Because the dreadfully swollen hatred all around it will not permit it to step outside its border. A nation that cannot show its face. Friedrich Meinecke, often referred to as the dean of the German historians. These people come from across the political spectrum, operating in vastly different religious and philosophical traditions in different fields of society. Friedrich Meinecke, the greatest of the German historians. The raw material of Hitlerism consisted to a certain degree of racial ideology with its central point of hatred against the Jews. Of this, there was already a certain amount in every country, or it could be simulated. It wasn't really the Germans, it was everybody hating the Jews. When the racial ideology and hatred of the Jews was somewhat ineffective as raw material for the needs of the masses, some other ideology hatched by theorists or sects could be substituted for it and duly pumped up. The Jews, who tend unreflectively to enjoy the favor of the economic situation, once it smiles on them, have caused considerable annoyance since their emancipation. Many Jews we see also among those who raised to their lips, much too hastily and greedily, the cup of power which had fallen to them. This is a book, by the way, translated into English in 1946, still assigned in German history courses. The German Catastrophe. Old canard about the Jews who enjoyed particular exploitation of the economic circumstances. Here's just another one. Wilhelm Röpke, the designer of the German economic miracle. Classic liberal. If we consider all this soberly and with scientific objectivity, we can no longer doubt that the worldwide catastrophe today is the gigantic price the world has to pay for its deafness to all the warning signals that prophesied with ever-increasing shrillness from 1930 and 1939 the hell the satanic forces of National Socialism were to let loose. First against Germany herself, that is, Germany was the victim of the Nazis, and it was everybody else's fault for not listening. First against Germany herself, and then against the rest of the world. The horrors of the war correspond exactly with those that the world permitted Germany to suffer, while it actually maintained normal relations with the Nazis and organized with them international festivals and congresses. Even the racial mania that seems to be an exclusive domain of German totalitarianism was presented to the Germans by foreigners, particularly by the French writer Gobineau, it wasn't German, it was French, who himself simply elaborated the idea which dates back into the 18th century. The racial delusion may be described as a cross between those foreign germs and the specifically German ethical romanticism, which will occupy us later. While these and other precursors of the Nazi racial doctrine have nothing in common with the appalling delusionary character of that doctrine, the fact remains that it is the abyss into which we are inevitably plunged if we once pursue the mistaken path of the biologism of which Darwin and his school laid the foundations. The Nazi racial doctrine is the final putrid product of the decay of an intellectual process by which the course of the 19th century man was degraded with the zeal of a misunderstood science to a subject of zoology and stud farming. But in this process, all the principal countries of the West took part. Nothing to see here in Germany. Okay. Now it gets a little darker even. Get darker, it gets darker. We need to go, these by the way are mainstream people we're talking about. Now if we go to the ultra-conservatives of the Weimar period or the Nazi period. Carl Schmitt, who in the last decades has his work gone under a revival. Lots of people read Carl Schmitt in legal theory courses in political science these days. Carl Schmitt, the crown jurist of the Third Reich, writes in his memoirs as he sits in prison in Nuremberg, as God allowed hundreds of thousands of Jews to be killed, he simultaneously saw the revenge that they would take on Germany. And that which he foresees today for the Avengers and those demanding restitution, humanity will experience in another unexpected moment. It's not entirely clear what he's talking about. Maybe he's talking about Bolshevization or the invasion of the Russians. But what the equation between what the Germans did to the Jews and the Jews are now doing to the Germans. You think it's the Jews doing to the Germans? Well, if there's any doubt, he says so. The platform of democratic equality is only the springboard for new inequalities. That is de Tocqueville's real fear. The consequential equality is never real, and only in a single fleeting second true. In the moment in which the old privileges are renewed and the new are not yet openly consolidated, that is, in the barely tangible moment of the transformation from the old discriminations to the news, that fabulous interview in which neither the Nazis persecute the Jews nor the Jews persecute the Nazis. What is this thing? Here's Ernst Jünger in uniform in occupied Paris with his buddy, the SS general. We have seen the victims of this war. To their somber ranks, all nations add their contingent. Everyone shared in the guilt. Everyone shared in the guilt. And there is no one who did not stand in need of the healing powers which be found in the realm of suffering. As a result, peace must bear fruit for them all. That is, this war must be won by all. Here, in an introduction to the English translation of Jünger's memoir, it's high time that the moral insanity which gripped America during and after the war concerning all things German, that raving frenzy of hatred so assiduously fostered by the Emil Ludwigs, the Morgenthaus, and Vansittart. Vansittart was the British Morgenthau, so-called propagandist who wrote about inbred German aggression, gives way to a rational attitude to what is called, somewhat condescendingly, the German problem. Modern man has a fatal propensity for attempting to free himself of his own feelings of guilt, his own anxieties and terrors by projecting them onto some scapegoat, some incarnation of absolute evil, which he burdens with all the sins, all the shortcomings that he came to face within himself. Does anybody know who Louis Clare was? Some of you were at my talk yesterday, and I talked about Maurice Halbwachs, and I blamed the sociologist Louis Koser for his poor translation and poor selection of texts by Halbwachs. Louis Clare is Louis Koser. Only the sociologists would care about that, who, by the way, was Jewish. What happens to Jünger? Well, he gets postage stamped. Never won the Nobel Prize. Lots of people think that this was a crime. Well, let's go to the left. How am I doing on time? I didn't look when I started. 5 minutes? 10, okay. Here on the political left, Kurt Schumacher, the leader of the SPD, the Social Democratic Party after the war. Schumacher himself spent most of the Nazi period in concentration camp. suffered miserably and didn't live very long after the war. Schumacher goes on a tour of the United States after the war to try to drum up support for the social democratic movement in post-war Germany. And he gives the following statements. We want to deliver reparations, but we do not want to commit suicide. One cannot excuse the injustice today by pointing to past injustice. So that's sort of exactly what he's doing. The Nazi policy of plunder must not be a model for the policy of the United Nations. So in other words, the occupation authorities are employing the same politics and policy of plunder that the Nazis did of their occupied lands. Social democracy opposed racist anti-Semitism with the same determination and relentlessness with which it rejects totalitarianism. With the same seriousness with which we want to ensure that the Germans should not become a second-class people with fewer rights, we fight for the Jews with all the other people of the earth. In this sense, the cause of Jews in a new Germany is also a German cause and a cause for the equal treatment of all people. In other words, using the experience of the Jews to argue for the particularly appropriate policy attitude towards the Germans. And finally, good old Konrad Adenauer himself, the first Chancellor of West Germany. The unconditional surrender of the leaders of the German army never had the consequence that Germany ceased to exist. It never meant that for Germany the right to self-determination was suspended. Those to whom injustice has occurred, and we must recognize that in the National Socialistic period, injustice was done. Classic for Adenauer, nobody ever did injustice. Injustice was always done. The master of the passive tense. Shocking. We have to acknowledge that some bad things happen, you think? Those to whom injustice has occurred, we must now recognize that in the National Socialistic period, injustice was done, do not thereby have the right themselves to do injustice. It is true, through National Socialism it became clear what depths the people in Germany were capable of, which one never would have believed. But does this apply only for the German people? Strong applause. Has the world since Hitler's death and the disappearance of National Socialism become just, peaceful, and quiet? Did the Germans agree in Quebec that the Russians should occupy half of Germany? Did the Germans participate at Yalta and Potsdam? How do you think a German, English, or American historian in 20 or 30 years will judge all of this? I do not believe that he will say Germany is guilty for everything. In foreign people as well, there is a piece of Hitler. It's what in German we call chutzpah. I do not believe that he will say Germany is guilty for everything. In foreign peoples as well, there's a piece of Hitler. And indeed, no small piece. For this reason, we Germans do not need to go around forever in sackcloth and ashes, doing penance because things started in Germany. Sackcloth and ashes forever. This speech, 1946. National Socialism committed terrible crimes. Crimes about which historians will write with horror in later times. But the Morgenthau Plan, which thank God was not carried out, although it was worked out and prepared in all the details, represents a crime against humanity that worthily stands by the side of the National Socialist crimes. Wow. Okay. Lively shouts. Quite right. Sehr richtig. If one planned right down to the operational details to allow 30 to 40 million Germans to die by choking them economically, then the outline and contemplation of such a plan betrays such an abyss of cruelty and inhumanity that by God one can one can any longer speak of a Christian spirit. Don't speak of a Christian spirit because when speaking of a Christian spirit, what spirit are we speaking of? The Pharisees were speaking of the Jewish spirit, which is a vengeful spirit. The Morgenthau Plan is finished, but the time will come when those who devised it will be ashamed to talk about it. But I have the feeling that some manifestation of this Morgenthau Plan are still affecting us. It's time for this to stop. And there are other slides I could go on, but I come back to my central question. What is this thing? I think I've provided sufficient evidence that this thing exists. and have described its contours. In Freudian terms, it's projection. We project onto others the evil that we have in our own hearts. We believe that others are going to do it to us, and so we better do it to them before they do it to us. This was the justification that was later talked about. Hitler responding to the protocols of the Elders of Zion, or as came out in the historians' dispute of the mid-1980s, to the World Jewish Congress's statement that if there is to be war with Germany, Jews everywhere in the world will naturally be on the other side. Big surprise. As a justification for a war of self-defense. And if you look at some of the language justifying Nazi aggression in 1939, leading up to 39 and thereafter, much of the rhetoric was about German self-defense, that we were threatened. We were surrounded on all sides. So we've got projection. But my problem as a scholar, philosophically speaking, again, is to describe this thing. My instant recourse is to Freudian categories. Right? We know about defense mechanisms. Freud comes up with a long list of the mechanisms that the ego generates to defend itself against feelings of guilt. Repression, denial, projection, reversal. One of the ones that was prominently on display in the mid-1980s in the context of the Bitburg affair was relativization. We saw elements of relativization in some of these statements. It wasn't just us. Look, anti-Semitic, everybody was anti-Semitic. There was some in Germany too, but Gobineau, he was French, and the British, they had their eugenics, and it was everywhere, and it just happened accidentally like a tornado. It happened to touch down here. It has nothing to do with us. And false equivalences. Be really careful that you democratic allies don't do the same thing. And in fact, the expectation reads in, takes Goebbels' misreading of Morgenthau, the enemy of humanity everywhere, projects onto Morgenthau an evil intent which the historical record does not in fact bear up. Morgenthau nor Roosevelt, neither Morgenthau nor Roosevelt, was the author of Theodor Kaufmann's ridiculous book, whatever it was, pamphlet. Morgenthau never intended to sterilize Germans, never intended to undermine the conditions for the maintenance of a basic standard of living. His proposal was to, for a period of time, to close the mines, which he was able to sell to Churchill with the rhetoric of, well, if the German mines close, then the Welsh mines will start having booming business, and it will save the British economy, which was devastated by the war. The impetus for the Morgenthau Plan was Morgenthau's experience as a trust buster. German heavy industry was capable of certain kinds of things. It was the Russians, by the way, who were in favor of radical dismantling. I will go back to just one slide. We're all familiar with the important moment of the Nuremberg Tribunal, this beacon of reckoning with crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg Tribunal gave us the legal novum, crimes against humanity. Nuremberg, by the way, is completely... Oops. There you go. Stay. A couple of things to remember, or to not misremember, about the Nuremberg Tribunals. Does anyone know who came up with the idea for the Nuremberg Tribunals?
Stimson was the main promoter.
First idea of trial like this was Stalin.
Show trial.
Show trial. Yes. There was some debate, for instance, about whether the Soviets, with their history of political oppression, should actually serve on the tribunal at all. Another thing that's misremembered about the Nuremberg Tribunals is, despite the articulation of the principle of the crimes against humanity and the idea of collective crime. So there were indictments of entire criminal organizations. The court found that they could not, in fact, follow that principle. They could condemn the SS as a criminal organization, but guilt had to be determined individually based on your membership in the criminal organization. So we have a misremembering, and by and large, in the German population, this was seen as victor's justice in spades. That there was an argument, particularly by people like Adenauer and Kogan and others, that it should have been the Germans themselves who conducted the tribunals. Of course, which Germans should have conducted the tribunals was an interesting question. On the issue of the so-called Fragebogen, additionally, for instance, there was a great process going on where the way in which you were exonerated from a denazification procedure was you got testimony from people who had power to exculpate you, to say, actually, he's a good guy. Character reference. Who were the people who were approached for character references? Jews. Right? If you could get a letter from a Jew, it was very useful in your denazification procedure. But I come back to this question, which after 20 years of working on this issue and 20 years of thinking about cultural theory, I still don't know how to name. As a sociologist, I don't like taking recourse to psychoanalysis, to essentially individualistic level explanations. It doesn't work as an individualistic psychology does not work when everybody, unless you think of it as a disease, like it's a flu epidemic, and everybody is infected with the same version of the same virus. An individualistic explanation doesn't help. So as a sociologist, I think of it as culture, as deep structure, a set of dispositions which people from varieties of different perspectives employ in similar ways. That there is a culture structure out there which individuals, like there is a language and we each speak the language, we do it in our own ways, but we can't start speaking in new words or we won't be understood. This is the culture of post-war Germany, which in profound ways is much more substantially continuous with wartime and pre-war Germany than the rhetoric of the 0 hour or the Caesura would have us believe. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We open it up to questions. I will ask the person who wants to ask a question to use the microphone. So start here.
Thank you for your talk. I wasn't sure whether your argument was mostly about post-war German culture or about rehabilitating Morgenthau. Morgenthau, I'm very, very happy his plan didn't see the light of day, because if it had, the way it was conceived, we would never have had the process of reparation, I don't think so, to the Israeli state in the early 50s. I think also, when you cite Adenauer, I recommend everybody to look at the text of Jeffrey Hirth online about Charlottesville and Germany. Adenauer indeed said what you said in '46. He also made a speech, which then he incorporated in his memoirs in the '60s, saying, what has brought us so low, Germans? We need to interrogate ourselves. We are all responsible for the destruction we brought upon others. So it's possible he didn't name the Jews specifically, but I think that in many ways, as Judd shows in his very good book on post-World War II history, there were a lot of struggle around those concepts. And finally, I would like to say about Pharisee, and you said yourself that it has entered the language. Certainly when I was a child in the 50s, 60s, and I was raised in a Christian family, and we talked about Pharisee, we never thought of Jews. It was always applied to us, by the same token, we didn't think of Jesus as a Jew, you know. So Pharisee was hypocrisy, and it was a term which applied to anybody in the culture. I'm not saying my experience is the only one, but I think a lot of people didn't necessarily associate Pharisee with Jews, specifically when they talked about it.
Shall I respond? So I would just say that is certainly true for common people, but the speakers that I'm mentioning here certainly did know. We're talking about theologians And whether or not Pharisee was a common reference as a hypocrite in German language and culture, the people who were using this word were very well aware that the Pharisees were Jews. And I'm not advocating political correctness, but one would think, all right, let's pick a different word. Let's not use that word in that particular context. I don't remember, though I certainly have read Herf's work, and I'm sure I read that Adenauer speech. What I would say is, I have to, it's been a long time since I read Adenauer's speeches, but maybe he said something like that in the 60s. He certainly didn't when he was chancellor.
I'm an historian. Let me thank you for the lecture and the very telling evidence of what was said, what was thought at this moment in Germany after the war. Were you an historian, you probably would have presented the string of quotes more precisely in terms of the dates, at least what years these come from, because it seems to me that they all represent a particular phase, a particular moment in German history and German society and culture in the first years after the war, when there was enormous social and economic suffering, when the denazification process and the Allied occupation policies were objectively very harsh and certainly perceived as being very harsh. If you were to give a second lecture, I would be eager to hear what happens to this rhetoric and these attitudes, say by 1960 in Germany, whether the same imagery is still coming up. This historically bound character of the quotes you're offering, which I'd like to see presented more carefully historicized, also leads me to ask whether we could contextualize the references to Pharisees and other such more thoroughly in the rhetorical discursive traditions of German Christians. Because one could argue that the long-term impact of Luther's translation of the Bible, of Christian theology, New Testament stories of the life of Jesus, and make an argument that when Pharisees are talked about, when the children of Israel talked about, there's some distance, not total, but some distance between them in the mind of German Christians and modern Jews. So that not completely divorced by any means, but it has a different resonance. Pharisees are not simply to be equated with modern Jews, one could argue. And I think that needs more careful analysis as well.
Well, first of all, I would respond that I have 40 minutes to give a lecture, and there's just so much that I can cover. The lecture is based on almost 1,000 pages of book. 2 books, one book in the House of the Hangman, which deals with the period of 43 to 49, and then Sins of the Fathers, which deals from 49 to the present. All of the quotes that I presented were from 1945 to 1949. Yet I would also argue, and one of the justifications for writing the book in the House of the Hangman was I actually started to write Sins of the Fathers first. I started, I'm going to write about how the Germans remember the Nazi past, and so since I'm interested in state theory and things like that, it's very convenient, I'll start on September 1st, 1949, when the West German state came into existence. And I said, a lot of these things, there were some speeches by Adenauer and Schumacher and Heuss and lots of others, sort of in the election campaign leading up to September 1949. So I better do a little bit on the period before that. And so I set out to write a 20 or 30 page preface to the Sins of the Fathers, and instead I wrote a new 500-page book called In the House of the Hangman. But what I also noticed is I couldn't even start in 1945, but I had to look at it. So one of the challenges I find when I wear my historian's hat, which I don't do very often, is that the conventional periodization has created a balkanization of expertise in the field. So there are people who work on World War II, and they stop their work on May 8th, 1945. There are specialists in the post-war interregnum 45 to 49. Then the historians of West Germany start their work. And there's not a tremendous amount of reading across those so-called ruptures, which were not as dramatic ruptures as they're sometimes portrayed. And so what I strove to do in The House of the Hangman was to read across some of those boundaries, particularly from starting with 43 and going to 49 and then continuing it with the sins of the fathers. So one of the questions then is what happens thereafter, and that's the story of the sins of the fathers. The discourse certainly changes, and in marked ways in different periods, but one of my tasks was in fact to trace out that evolution. So I hope that you'll find at least some of what you find lacking in this particular presentation in the actual heavily footnoted pages of the book, but we all make our choices as to what we can do in 40 minutes.
Well, I want to thank you. I'm neither a historian nor a sociologist nor a political scientist, but rather a Germanist in the field of German literary studies. So I was really fascinated and quite struck, and I really am grateful for the way in which you gave, I thought, a very helpful way of contextualizing the ongoing debates in Germany about victimhood. And since you began with Sebald, I also just want to say that, you know, when Air War in Literature, when the translation came out, which was almost simultaneous with the translation of Günter Grass's Crab's Walk in Krebsgarten, and really sparked or seemed to rekindle this debate about how Germans were willing to go back into the German as victim narrative. And what struck me, and it was almost astonishing, is if there is another layer of cultural amnesia in that this entire trajectory that you sketched out for us in such great detail was almost entirely absent from that public debate in Germany. It was as if from, let's say, 1952 until the publication of Sebald, and by the way, as you know, he was really pilloried and continues to be in Germany, not in this country, precisely for the perception at any rate that he has returned to want to, you know, sort of fold Germans back into the narrative, to the victim narrative. So I was just so struck by that kind of cultural amnesia, and grateful to you actually for the reminder of that other textual and cultural layer. So thank you for that.
One of my central concepts in my theories of memory is what I call the memory of memory. So every statement about the past is not only about the past, it's not only about the political constellation of the present, but it's also in some way in dialogue with all the memories of that past that came in between. So that can also there's a memory of memory. There's also a memory of forgetting, or there's also a forgetting of memory. So every combination happens. I'll give you just one example. In 1985, when Ronald Reagan went to Bitburg, some of us are old enough to remember that, there was a huge controversy about how to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the end of the war. One of the interesting things is that there were a number of issues that came up 10 years later in 1995 on the 50th anniversary of the end of the war, except the one word you saw nowhere, anywhere, in any statement, in any newspaper article in 1995 was Bitburg. So that's the forgetting of memory. Bitburg was the memory of forgetting.
A little simpler question. I'm just curious, in central Berlin, there's a memorial to the Red Army, which on the west side, formerly West Berlin. What I don't understand, in a relatively short period of time, West Germans forgot the Red Army's march into what was East Berlin, as brutal as they were, and they literally dismantled East Germany. So I'm wondering if you've ever run across that in any of your research.
So you're talking about the East German, the memorial with the Kette-Klowitz Pietà?
I'm not sure, I've seen it, but it's in West Berlin.
In the West. So there was, in East Berlin, there was a war memorial with a Pietà sculpted by Kette-Klowitz. Am I right about that? I'm right, yeah. And that's been maintained sort of as a sort of narrative reconciliation. You can't get rid of the forms of memory and identity by executive fiat.
Is that on Unter den Linden you're referring to?
No.
There's a small pietà in the Wache
Right,
on
the
Unter
Neue
den
Wache,
Linden
yeah.
by the Historisches Museum.
Right.
Okay, but that is a replacement
Yeah.
after the wall came down for what was a more conventional
Right.
Soviet-style
Right.
soldier
Yes.
that they removed,
Yeah.
and then they put the pietà in
Right.
after the fall of the wall.
Right. So Berlin is this great example of what we call a palimpsest, a geography that is, layer upon layer of meaning and reference. And so any street corner, you've got, any marker, you've got markers under it. I gave the example in my lecture yesterday. If you go to Warsaw, where Willy Brandt went down on his knees in front of the Nathan Rappaport Warsaw Ghetto Memorial, a number of years later, right next to the Rappaport sculpture, they put up a second monument or memorial commemorating Brandt's commemoration. And so there's a little picture of Brandt, a little bronze plaque of Brandt on his knees next to the place where Brandt went on his knees to commemorate German crimes. So again, another example of what I call the memory of memory. Berlin is an immensely complicated landscape, layer upon layer upon layer. The German historian Peter Reicher once talked about the grace of the calendar. But actually there's not only the grace of the calendar, there's sort of the challenges of the calendar. For instance, November 9th, Kristallnacht, is also the day the Berlin Wall came down. It's also an anniversary of the putsch. So even the dates become occupied with layers and layers of different historical reference. And untangling them. What's that?
Abdication of the Kaisers.
Abdication of the Kaisers, right. So, there's no date which doesn't have, an archaeological strata of memory. The interesting question is how the different strata interact and whether they can be recovered and whether one comes from the bottom to the top. And Berlin's a fascinating place to be a cultural archaeologist. Yes.
So I have a question about maybe using Freud in a different way, and it's just a mental exercise. You mentioned how he uses the psychoanalytic, prognostical template almost to see how people deal with guilt. I was wondering if we could see him for a second as a discourse analyst of the society he lives in, and then embed these deep structures that he identified at that point and see it as a continuum.
Yeah, absolutely. I often say that I think Freud is an underrated sociologist. Particularly his last 4 works were all profoundly sociological. Civilization as Discontents, Future of an Illusion, Totem and Taboo, and most importantly for me, Moses and Monotheism. In all of these works, he's actually, and in a number of essays, he's actually developing the concept of collective psychology, and particularly in Moses and Monotheism, interrogating how a collective act of repression is transmitted over millennia without leaving either oral or written traces. And so the question then is whether the process of collective repression is the same as, analogous to, or completely different from the process of psychological repression in the individual. And it's a question that Freud didn't solve, though he's got some pretty good suggestions. I've written pretty extensively about Moses and Monotheism.
Yes. So I'm a product of the era that you described, so I'm very hesitant to articulate myself. The quotations that you present are startling and some are surprising. And you did say that the people you quote are from a wide range of the philosophical and political spectrum. And many of us who know something about Germany are aware of the role that these people play in history. in the history of thought. Some may not be in the audience, may not be quite so aware. You could pick many of the characters whom you showed, including Thomas Mann, who emigrated, who played a major role in anti-Nazi, I think it was BBC campaigns, right, as a speaker, giving speeches against the Nazi regime that were transmitted into Germany. So it would be interesting in a way to see how the quotations that you present us with appear in the gestalt, in the overall gestalt of the intellectual outlook, and I think they might take a somewhat different shape than when they're being looked at in isolation as you looked at them. But when we look at them in the entire gestalt of the mindset of those who produce these quotations, then they're in some way even more startling, of course. I would like, I don't know how much more time we have, but I would like to push you a little bit to go beyond Freud. You are a sociologist, and you are one of the most prominent thinkers about collective memory, and there are aspects of collective memory in this. You yesterday laid out the different explanatory factors that help us make sense of collective memory. If you would maybe spend a couple of minutes to provide us with sociological approaches that can help us make sense of the thing that you talked about today.
Okay, so I guess I was being somewhat disingenuous when I say I don't have a theory of the thing. I think I do know what the thing is. I think it's culture. I think it's that's what we mean by culture, is a set of described dispositions which in some ways speak through this. I mean, it's silly postmodern expressions like Derrida's that authors don't write texts, texts write authors, and I'm not a postmodernist and I don't buy that, but there is a certain sense in which we are all speaking a language which pre-exists us. And there is a structure of possibilities of what can be said by people who inhabit particular positions. One of the things that surprised me, so I approached this work with the theory of cultural fields, that it would be very clear that there are some things that you can say when you're the chancellor, which you can't say if you're a priest. And there are some things you can say if you're a novelist that you can't say if you're a politician. But what I found, and in the book In the House of the Hangman, the structure is organized by the different social fields. So a chapter on politics, a chapter on religion and the churches, a chapter on psychology, a chapter on philosophy, a chapter on literary approaches and the like. And each of these fields does have its different arrangements and its different tropes, but that there are, in sociological language, there are homologies in the culture structures across these different fields. And one of the things that I was trying to do was to trace those. And part of it is the interesting reaction that I've gotten, not in a while because that book was published in 2005, but what was interesting when historians would read that book, there are two reactions. I didn't think there was anything new to say about this period, but in fact he says something new, which is good. But what was interesting is each of them liked a particular chapter. Each of the review, take the 20 or so reviews the book got, each of them said, chapter 7 is particularly good, but chapter 9 everybody knows. The next review would say, chapter 9 is really interesting and new, but chapter 7 everybody knows. Which to me is again a sign of the balkanization of the kind of research that I was doing. So what I was trying to do is read not just across periods, across these sort of, the kinds of dates that usually appear in titles of books or on the in the course catalog identifying the subject matter of the course, but across the fields, to read novelists and poets in the same, and discuss in the same book but a different chapter, as I was discussing people like Adenauer and Schumacher. Another problem with this kind of approach is, yes, I am selecting out juicy quotes to make a point. I am being a manipulative speaker. As I said, in the books themselves, there's a lot of people I don't talk about. There's also public opinion data about reception and what people thought of these things. Any particular kind of memory needs to be embedded and contextualized within a wider discursive context. Yeah, so there are strengths and weaknesses, and there's a choice I'm making to try to provoke people to show that I actually do believe there's this. One of the questions was, what happens after 1949? And that, again, was the subject matter of the book. You find the same tropes and the same things appearing again and again. So I see, for instance, the debates and the story dispute of the mid-1980s. I see that as the Jaspers debate redux. It takes place in a different context. So my methodological prescription is that we need to understand any particular mnemonic or commemorative statement or gesture or symbolism, certainly within relation to what it's supposedly commemorating. There is a relationship between the object of commemoration and the commemorative text. There's also a relationship between the commemorative text and the set of circumstances in which the commemorative text is being produced. But what's missing from many analyses in collective memory is the connective structure or tissue that happens in between, which is why I gave the example of the silence in 1995 about 1985. So the principle I use here is dialogism. There is a dialogue that cuts through time. In The Sins of the Fathers, the book is structured according to two analytical principles. One I call profile and one I call genre. Profile is the effort, just like if you're looking at a silhouette, if there were sun streaming in and you couldn't see the features of my face, but you could only see the silhouette. This is a synchronic snapshot of an era. The ways in which symbols and meanings that exist at a particular time relate in a structural manner to each other. So the freeze frame temporal analysis of French structuralism, for instance. And so what I do in Sins of the Fathers is identify three, what I call legitimation profiles, three eras of West German history. The first running from 49 to 66, which I call the reliable nation, where Adenauer and his successors are trying to argue that West Germany is a reliable nation, and a reliable nation deals with the past in these ways. Then a second period I call the moral nation from 66, has origin 63, but up to about 1974, when Helmut Schmidt becomes chancellor. The controversial thing is I date the end of what I call the moral nation, which entails a different version of history. I date it to the end of Bond's era, and I put Schmidt with the third section. I find Schmidt's rhetoric about the past more akin to Helmut Kohl's than I do to Willy Brandt's. The third period I call the normal nation as a rhetoric, and that entails a particular version of history. While I've got these three profiles, synchronic culture structures, the book is also suffused with what I call genre, which are the longitudinal threads of discourse, so that when you go to give a speech, let's say on a May 8th anniversary, whether it's the 20th or the 30th or the 40th, you're thinking about what are the historically accrued meanings and expectations for a speaker like myself on this particular occasion. And so you are as much in dialogue with the previous commemoration on that date or in that place as you are with the other commemorative gesture that's going on a day before or a day after, or even sometimes remarkably on the same day in a completely different context. So the structure that I'm looking for includes both the synchronic in terms of the concept of profile and the diachronic in terms of the threads of genre. So I try to show how speakers can say radically different things, employ radically different symbols or meanings about the past, even in a speech at 9 o'clock in the Bundestag, and then another one at 2 o'clock in the afternoon at a research conference, and in the evening, then a different one yet. And so identify a number of different genres of German commemoration, which are cross-cut and run through the profiles without trying to lose the synchronic structure. So that was probably way too much sociological for most people in the room, but you asked for it.
Yes, it did. It is late But I have a burning question for Jeff, which is what are the broad implications of the German example, of the German case? Your legitimation profiles, and you see this tension, right, between memory of atrocious past and national identity, and you assess a continuation of rejection of collective guilt throughout these three periods. On the other hand, Germany has become a model in terms of so-called Vergangenheitsbewältigung, the coming to terms with the past, the model of facing the past, of transitional justice measures, symbolic, political, etc. So, what can we learn from the German example? Since you highlight its shortcomings, but on the other hand, at the end in your conclusions, you also underline what is modelic about Germany. Maybe you can say a few words.
Well, so the slogan I employ in the end of The Sins of the Fathers is, I think of German memory much like Winston Churchill thought about democracy, which is it's a terrible system and a whole lot better than whatever's in second place. German memory is highly flawed. It's not the triumphant success story of the proper way to come to terms with the past that the cliche has, and yet they did a better job and have done some remarkable things. I'll also say that the entire world today now, in many regards, I guess not always, not everywhere, speaks the language of political responsibility and regret. And yet when they speak political responsibility and regret, which is a topic I took up in another book, The Politics of Regret, when they do so, they do it with a German accent. Much of the vocabulary of transitional justice, the theory of memory, the analysis of the tropes, whether we're looking at the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission or humanitarian reconciliation movements in Latin America or after the fall of communism, most of the vocabulary that we as scholars and by extension politicians and public commentators are using was forged in the crucible of German struggles with memory and the philosophical thought that it generated. There are other discourses, there are other writers that I certainly could highlight as well if I want to be fair, but who wants to be fair? Again, I have a particular rhetorical purpose when I give this talk. So yes, it is the most successful failure story that there is. So it also generates the imperative to compare. By the same token, we also I have this debate with my Polish colleagues in the Genealogies of Memory project. One of the resistances in Poland, maybe even tied up with some of their new legislative idiocies, is that they very much feel as if there is a German arrogance when it comes to memory, right? Look how well we came to terms with our past. Let us help you do the same thing. There's another phenomenon, there's a wonderful German term, Sühnestolz, is pride in repentance. And I actually talk a lot about this in The Sins of the Fathers, particularly under Brandt. We Germans have acknowledged our crimes, so we are in fact more moral than the rest of you. I'm exaggerating, but there's an element of that. But again, the entire discourse about regret, reconciliation, transitional justice, historical accountability is suffused with a German rhetoric and speaks with a German accent. And so the lessons of the German case, I think, are worldwide and absolutely essential.
Well, on that note, we thank you very much for your lecture.